For most of the past 2 years, Poland's two main parties, the centrist Civic coalition and the right-wing nationalist Law and Justice Party, have remained very close together in national opinion polls, with the gap between them rarely widening beyond a few percentage points. However, since mid-September, a gap has opened between the two parties, with the Civic coalition, led by Prime Minister Donald Tusk, now nearly 10 points ahead of Law and Justice, which has fallen to its lowest point in the polls since 2012. So in this video, we'll take a look at the widening gap in the Polish polls, and try and explain why support for the right-wing Law and Justice Party is collapsing. On the night of the 2024 US election, Donald Trump told his supporters that God had saved his life for a reason, alluding to the assassination attempt on his life a few months earlier. In the latest issue of Too Long, we explore how faith-fueled populism, from Donald Trump to Vladimir Putin, has slowly been shaping modern democracy. That's just some of the 72 pages in the magazine, because as always, there's more to Too Long than you'd expect. Purchase your copy by clicking the link in the description. For decades, Polish politics has been a tug-of-war between two parties. The nationalist right-wing Law and Justice Party, or PIS, which Poland's president Karol Nawrocki belongs, and the centrist Civic platform, led by Prime Minister Donald Tusk. PIS governed Poland between 2005 and 2007, but the 2007 elections were won by Tusk's Civic platform, which gained a solid majority, and Tusk served as Prime Minister until 2014, when he resigned to serve as the President of the European Council. Then, at the 2015 parliamentary elections, the Civic platform failed to produce a candidate as popular as Tusk, and lost to the PIS, which governed for 2 consecutive terms until 2023. However, throughout this period, the PIS was plagued by corruption allegations. In 2019, a former Speaker of Poland's lower parliamentary house resigned over allegations he took more than 100 personal flights on a government jet. A former finance minister was accused of having links to a criminal gang, and the head of the central bank, a close friend of the PIS's leader, was involved in a pay scandal surrounding 2 senior aides. PIS also appointed party loyalists to key roles in the media and courts, creating widespread concerns about democratic backsliding, leading to the EU blocking over €100 billion in funding for Poland. Anyway, after the Polish election in October 2023, Tusk's Civic coalition were able to gain a narrow majority over Law and Justice, which otherwise had the biggest vote share, and they did this by teaming up with 2 other groups. Third Way, itself a coalition of the centrist Polska 2050 and the agrarian Polish People's Party, and the left. In other words, Tusk's government only really edged into power, and was always likely to face heavy pushback from PIS loyalists in Polish state institutions. Unsurprisingly, Tusk's multi-party coalition has also struggled with infighting, particularly over issues like public spending and the liberalization of Poland's ultra-conservative abortion laws. And last week, Polska 2050 also lost around half of its MPs following an intra-party split. As a result, for most of the period since the 2023 election, the Civic coalition struggled to open up a meaningful lead over PIS, with the two parties closely tracking each other in the polls. However, in the past 5 months, a notable gap has opened up between the two parties. The Civic coalition is now polling ahead of the PIS by around 8 points, its biggest lead over PIS since 2012. Zooming out a bit, we can also see that since 2019-2020, the Civic coalition has steadily risen in the polls, while in the same time period, PIS has fallen from a peak of almost 50% to just 26% now. So what's driving this decline, and why has PIS fallen to its lowest point since 2012? Well, it's essentially because PIS is losing support on 2 fronts. On one side, it's losing centrist voters to the Civic coalition, and on the other, it's losing anti-establishment voters to the far-right nationalist alliance, Confederation. Let's start with the first of those, that PIS is losing centre-right voters to Tusk's Civic platform. Tusk is broadly considered to be a popular figure by Polish political standards, and is especially known for his strengths in diplomacy and foreign policy. Specifically, over the past few months, as PIS has declined, Tusk has successfully boosted Poland's geopolitical profile, gaining praise for his fierce criticism of the Kremlin after the incursion of 19 Russian drones into Polish airspace in September, and the subsequent sabotage attack on a Polish railway in November, as well as more recently getting praise for his more assertive diplomacy towards the US, which has seen him work to insulate Poland, one of the US's closest European allies, from Trumpian turbulence. As we covered in a recent video, tensions between Poland and the US are at recent highs, with the US ambassador to Poland severing relations with Poland's parliamentary speaker last month following a spat on X. Fortunately for Tusk, this looked like a rather petty move, supporting Tusk's view that Poland should hedge against American unpredictability by helping to strengthen Europe's own defense capacity. Conversely, PIS, which somewhat resembles the US's Republican Party in its social conservatism and populist rhetoric, actually threw its weight behind the US, demanding the Polish speaker's resignation, a position that puts PIS out of step with most of Poland, which generally sees the US negatively under Trump. Tusk's hardening of rhetoric and policy on things like migration may also have won over some voters from PIS. The second reason for PIS's decline, though, is the loss of support on the party's right. Since early 2022, as PIS has fallen in the polls, we can see a corresponding rise in support for the far-right party Confederation. For context, Confederation doesn't think that PIS is sufficiently nationalist, with the party's 2020 presidential candidate criticizing Poland's then president, PIS's Andrzej Duda, for working with what he called politically correct circles, including, quote, Jewish left-wing mainstream media and large international corporations. Confederation also calls for a total ban on abortion and wants to transform Poland into an ethnocracy based on Catholic principles. The party has essentially tried to normalize its far-right policies and create a reputational shield around itself by portraying itself as a more competent, meritocratic alternative to PIS, with a stronger focus on nativism and nationalist ideology. Anyway, at the October 2023 election, Confederation won 7% of the vote, but it's now polling at around 13%, implying that it's doubled its support. This is largely a consequence of disillusionment among hardline right-wingers, who see PIS as having compromised its nationalist agenda, for instance on EU matters, immigration, or in not pushing through more sweeping judicial changes. This has heightened perceptions of PIS as another establishment party, as opposed to a radical one. As such, Confederation has swept up the more hardline ideological purists and anti-establishment voters, particularly young men, who have become frustrated with PIS. More recently, another new and even further right party, the Crown, has been picking up steam too, rising to 9% in the polls. In conclusion then, PIS has struggled to maintain its relatively broad electoral coalition, losing voters in both directions, and unless it can get a grip on this fragmentation, this could result in a further fall in the polls. This, however, does not mean that Donald Tusk can rest easy. His coalition partners are floundering in the polls, and the emergence of new far-right parties pose their own challenge. And the veto power held by Poland's PIS president continues to be an obstacle for Tusk in implementing his agenda. As we mentioned earlier, the latest issue of our magazine, Too Long, is out very soon, and if you subscribe using code SPRING26, then you can get your first copy for as little as $4.99, as well as 20% off every future copy, as long as you stay subscribed. This latest issue features our ranking of the world's 25 most influential people, using ratings from you, our audience, as well as our journalists. Inside, we reveal not only the full ranking, but also the stories of a number of people who made the list, from the return of Donald Trump and the calculated moves of Xi Jinping, to the AI frontiers of Sam Altman. We also look at the new entries, New York's first Muslim Mayor Zohran Mamdani, the radical shift of Pope Leo XIV, and bastion of technocracy Mark Carney, as well as the shadows that still linger, like Jeffrey Epstein. Across 72 pages, this issue of Too Long features a whole lot more than just that though. We also have our whole cover story dedicated to how the UK became more divided than ever, and how a broken country can rebuild, as well as the fragmentation that's emerged within the EU, and how religion is being hijacked by politicians. Pre-order your copy at toolong.news, and remember to use code SPRING26 for our best ever price.